just think it's important to sit with one another. And I sure can hear a lot more about someone's life that I don't understand. And someone can sit with me and all the things they don't understand about my life or my choices or my decisions. Face to face, we can sit in that and be a lot more generous, gracious, merciful, and understanding of one another. And I think when we leave those conversations, because of the grace and mercy that's present with face-to-face conversations, we leave wanting to be different.
Hello and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Julie Richter, and I am one of the associate pastors here at First United Methodist Church, Richardson. And with me every week is our worship director, Eric Chakowski. How's it going, Eric?
It is going great, Julie. How are you?
I'm good. We have been in a really fun sermon series for the last several weeks during this season of Lent, which is part of the Christian calendar, the 40 days leading up to Jesus' death and resurrection. And we've been in a sermon series called The Greatest Story, following not only the story of Jesus' life, but the greater story that we find in Scripture.
And so we thought it really appropriate today to bring on just an incredible communicator and storyteller. He's a guy that I've had the pleasure of playing with from time to time in some of his musical endeavors, but he's an author and podcaster, interviewer, communicator, and storyteller, as well as a fantastic musician. We are so excited today to welcome to the podcast Andrew Greer. Well, we are here today with Andrew Greer. Andrew is just sort of a Renaissance man. He's a musician and a creator and an author and a communicator and a storyteller, and we are just delighted to speak with Andrew Greer today. Andrew, thanks for being with us all the way from Nashville.
Yeah, Nashville, rainy Nashville, Tennessee, but I do miss Texas, Eric and Julie, because as you know, I am a Texan.
A Texan.
That's right.
And when you're a Texan for a short period of time, you're always a Texan.
That's right. It's just in you after that point.
It's true. I realize that I have now lived half of my life in Tennessee, so I'm about to tip over the edge, of being a Tennessean. But I just don't think it doesn't sound right. It doesn't resonate.
Texas never leaves you, right?
No, never.
Yeah. You can take the Andrew out of Texas, but you can't take the Texas out of Andrew. Isn't that what they say?
Sure,
Yes.
That's what they all say.
Yeah, that's actually the whole intro. Thank you. That's the best intro I've ever received.
You are so welcome. You can take that with you wherever you go.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit. So you've got, as I mentioned, just a ton of interests, a ton of things that you do, both creatively and professionally, and a lot of times those things intersect. How did you come to be doing all of the variety of things that you do?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, that's a great question. I think more than ever in our generation, the three of us are in the same generation, we're in kind of these evolving professions. I think our professional life is so integrated with our personal lives, and we really want to do things that we find purposeful, meaningful. As Christians, something especially meaningful, like in the bigger picture perspective, kingdom of God. And so I think we've gotten away from the 30 years at a 9 to 5. And I certainly was not raised that way. My mom is a professional organist, and then she was a music educator. And my dad is a therapist of his own practice. And so my brothers and I came by it naturally that we would pave our own paths, and you can figure out how to make a living, how to provide for your family. But what is it that you want to do? And music was the first heartbeat. I mean, my mother started us all in piano lessons when we were 7, because I guess that was when we were considered we could read well enough, so she wouldn't have to read instructions to us or whatever, which I know many children read before age 7, but for the Greer household, we didn't really cross the line until 2nd grade. So that's when she started teaching us. And my oldest brother, he just wasn't going to take instruction from his mother. And my middle brother, of course, I was told all this. My middle brother cried every time my mom corrected him, and she was like, "Do you cry when your math teacher, corrects you?" And he's like, "No." So that didn't work out. And, but then there was me. And my mom only taught me for a little while, but I tell you this, I just remember there was so much resonance in my spirit, and I wouldn't have known how to articulate that then. But when I pressed my fingers on those keys from the first time, it was as if I was being connected, with that picture that is so much bigger than all of us. And now I've come to know that to be my creator. And so music was truly a language. It is a universal language. We know that it's a medium that is understood across the world and throughout all of history. I always think about the earth is actually singing. If you think about how instruments and their acoustic nature are just manipulating the sounds that are already resonating throughout the earth. And so music has always been, and I think it's always been the way that God has spoken throughout creation. That's my suspicion, at least. And so it certainly was the way that I was first spoken to by God, or the way maybe that I was given a pathway to speak to him. I'm not sure, where does that start? Where does that end? Our connection with God is so eternal. So pressing my hands into those piano keys just began something in my heart for communication. And really from that, I moved to Nashville, Tennessee when I graduated high school to attend Belmont University as a music major. Didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was a liner notes kid, and I loved kind of the making of music, And so I fell in love with Nashville and wanting to be a part of it somehow. Songwriting, especially for other Christian artists, and kind of learning how to do that and learning how to co-write and all that stuff became a part of my MO after college. But writing was in sync with that too, like pen to paper writing. And I think it just grew out of love of reading and love of really great articulations. Of course, growing up in Texas, the first thing you learned to spell was y'all. And then I figured out from there were better ways to say things, even though that's still one of the most charming things to hear from someone. But, all of it, Eric, I don't know how to fully answer that question, but you even led to this in the intro, like storyteller, communicator and storyteller. I've always been interested in how to communicate with people. And I remembered this the other day. I was on a road trip with my dad to New Mexico, and we were kind of pondering, like, how did I get from music and songwriting and performing and records to podcasts and interviewing all these people and writing books? And he said, I don't know if you remember this, but I loved music, all of it. I loved Black gospel so much. I mean, I wanted to be Black gospel, and I don't know if you can tell, but I'm Caucasian. And so it was not a thing that was really within my capability, but I believed it was. And so we would go to all these gospel shows and grew up on some Motown music. And I just loved everything. But my friends, it wasn't always music that was popular with my friend groups. So my parents would end up going a lot with me. They loved music of all kinds. And my dad said, you would always, like your mother and I would just stay in the lobby and wait for you, sometimes for hours, because you would find your way. It was a theater, or whether it was an arena or a church or whatever, would find my way backstage. And I wouldn't come back with an autograph or a photo. I just wanted to talk. I just wanted to know what made them tick and what was their motivation, because there was so much coming out through their performance on stage. They were communicating so much, and there's so much behind the notes and the microphone and the instruments. So I don't know that evolution of how to communicate and how I love communicating will ever find like an ending point. In fact, I think that's what we'll do forever,
Yeah. So, Andrew, I loved that image that you talked about when you said that music is our way in which we communicate, but it's also a way in which we understand God. And even in the church, it's a way in which we talk about how we understand God and how we seek God out. And obviously, hymns are so much a part of that. And for anyone who knows your work, it's evident in your recordings and in your concerts that you have a huge love for hymns. Can you talk for a minute about what it is about hymns that draws you to them?
Yeah, Julie, I mean, hymns, I think it's the history in the hymn. There is certainly a musical aspect for those of us who are musicians and maybe love some of the technical aspect of music. There's an arc in hymns that isn't always found in more modern expressions of music, even in pop music. There's a real arc to the melody. If you think about something like, come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy praise, and then that third line, da 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 da. It paints so many pictures. The horizon is not flat in hymns, musically speaking. And then go deeper into the context of where the hymns were written. There's so much rich history that connects me in 2019 as someone who is very aware of my brokenness and who's very aware of all the elements in my humanity that don't seem to line up with discipleship with Jesus. And I look at the hymns and I get this glimpse into a history of people who have lived within that tension of what it is to be within the confines of this flesh and bone, and yet be constantly pining for what we were created to be. And I think that's in, complete communion with God, and not to be swallowed up by God. that's been part of a learning process in my faith, that I don't think we're just evolve into this blob with God and eternity, but that we are individuals he has created to connect and commune with him, not just to be him. Discipleship, when you think about being a disciple of Jesus, we want to emulate Jesus. I think Jesus is asking us not just to emulate him, but to be with him.
Hmm.
And being with him, I think we will become more like him, but I think he wants the rub, like the contrast of, why is marriage such a holy thing? Why are our relationships so important? And it's because there's that contrast between two people. So hymns gives us like such a long history of people in the tensions of faith, and we know so many of the stories of some of the most famous hymns, but even behind the very niche or unknown hymns are a lot of heartache, a lot of sorrow, a lot of loss.
Yeah.
But within all that, a whole lot of hope, a whole lot of, I hear the Lord's Prayer just resonating throughout hymns, Our Father who's in heaven, holy is your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth here now as it is in heaven. That's what I hear, through the history of hymns. And I do believe that we're connecting with that long history of humanity when we sing those hymns that have some age in them.
Gosh, I love that idea of being with God, because we talk about Emmanuel and we talk about a God that chooses to be with us constantly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I spend enough time thinking about it in reverse, the choice for us to be with God and to be with one another. I think that that's a really powerful way to turn that and really see it in full relationship, that it's not just about a God that is with us, but the ways in which we choose to be with God.
Yeah, I mean, you would know much more, Julie, because of your background, like scripturally speaking. I mean, when it comes to theology or, like my backbone is weak, but I love scripture.
I think
and
it's stronger than you think.
Yeah.
maybe I do want to know what's true. I do want to know, but my suspicions just keep coming back to that. I do believe that because of who we are, that, God had to come to us. God stooped low, I guess, but he stooped low to raise us up, and I think how interesting it would be, especially in the context of the church, the body, and coming together to fellowship and to seek the truths of God. How interesting would it be if we lived out of the reality? We talk so much about original sin, and I grew up a lot in the church talking about original sin.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out where I find it in the Bible. I believe that I'm a sinner. I believe that I make decisions I don't know why I make, And so there's some kind of depravity at work in me. No doubt about that. But what I see is God creating us and saying it is good first, And so I just think there's so much to live into rather than avoid, that we're taught a lot to avoid this because we don't want to sin. And okay, but I'm going to. It's just gonna happen. So that's
Right.
not giving it leeway or a longer leash, but it's to say, what if I didn't focus on avoiding everything and instead of investing my time into what I could live into? And I do think that God has created us good. And part of that is what you're talking about, like that God wants to be with us and I want to be with him. So why don't we be together?
That's beautiful. So, talking about music as a language by which we communicate with God, we express our understanding of God. So, the last couple of decades, several decades, I suppose, has sort of seen the emergence of what we've sort of termed the contemporary Christian music world, right? And so many of these songs that are coming out of that movement. How do you feel like that movement has affected the way that more traditional hymns are utilized and taught or written for our worship gatherings?
That's a very interesting question because you could take it so many directions. First, I believe in new music. I believe in new songs and the writing of those and the implementation of those. I do because I love him so much and because I love the kind of astuteness of the musicality of it. I can definitely be a snob. I can definitely be like, you know, Tomlin, no thanks. But it's interesting because I've had the opportunity as well to lead worship through music in some really large gathering through the years, some in Lifeway conferences and some just in different churches being a guest, which I'm always honored that, someone would allow me to sit down at the piano and lead really their congregation
Mm.
in music. So I've had that opportunity a lot. And it's funny because, yes, hymns are very singable. They're very well known, even among those. I mean, they're well known in American music. They're part of the fabric of American music and history. So that's part of their relevance. Hymns are not just relegated to the church. But there are songs now from the past 20, 30, 40 years that have become also a part of the fabric of music as a whole, and then the music of the church that I love singing in the context. Like I think of new songs, and if someone were like, what's a new song you can just always go to? I could sing this song every time I sit down at the piano. I could sing the Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you.
Matt
And
Maher.
of
Yeah.
course it mimics the I need thee every hour, but only for a short second. So he only stole a little bit. And it's PD, so it doesn't matter. But there's always room for us to express ourselves in new ways. So it doesn't totally answer your question, Eric, as far as like maybe I'm being a little guarded, but I both don't love it because to be critical, I would say I think a good bit of the melodies. Now I'm talking about modern worship now. I'm not talking about contemporary Christian music as a whole, because there's some really amazing art that has happened through the history of contemporary Christian music that I think stands up with any musical art, So there is that, and that is still being created and will continue to be created. But if you're talking about what we're meant to sing or what has been designed for us to sing corporately, it is a little tough just because the melodies, if you're going to mimic pop music, which is not a bad thing, to have commercial success, you kind of have to take away, it has to be compressed a little bit and narrowed down. And that's not always the greatest thing for corporate singing. So I kind of say just call it what it is, right? Like if you're creating a great pop song, just create it. And it talks about your relationship with God or your walk, or for others to identify with in a spiritual manner, fantastic.
So from a very logistical standpoint, how do you feel like the movement away from holding hymnals in our hands during worship has contributed to sort of the simplification of some of the melodies for teaching? Talk a little bit about maybe the relationship you see there.
Well, that's a really interesting thought. I've never thought about that, how we don't read music culturally as widely. People
Right.
don't as widely read music as they used to. So that's part of that transition. But it is interesting. You're right. Yeah, I think some of the musicality, what I would call musicality, is diminished a little bit for that reason, that you don't have something to read. You can't watch something. You can't watch a melody go all over the page and sing to that. But there's a really great thing. I hate holding hymnals. So I have, dozens of hymnals in my home. I love having them nearby, but I don't like holding them in a worship context. If I'm in the congregation or if I'm in an audience that's being asked to sing, I don't want to hold a hymnal. And I'm not a big necessarily mover. I don't move my hands a lot or necessarily, but I do like the freedom of my body being able to be a little more present in the musical aspects of worship experiences. So, and I think for most people that's true. I see that even in older generations, no one's really like, I wish I could hold a hymnal. Maybe the Church of Christers, I don't know. But don't they put like stuff up there?
Yeah, I don't know, honestly. The interesting thing that we've seen in our church is even folks who really felt like they didn't want screens in worship initially, once we have them in and utilize them to project lyric content up there, the hymnals are rarely touched anymore, right?
Yeah.
They're not missed.
Yeah, right. And the other thing I'd say, to play devil's advocate a little bit, I couldn't agree more with your celebration of hymnody and just the richness and tradition, both musically and lyrically. One of the interesting conversations I had with somebody recently, about modern songs and sort of the simplicity to them is there are times in our faith lives and maybe even in our worship gatherings that all we want to do is sing simple truths about God, right? And we want to do so in a way that's memorable and easy to pick up on. And so I tend to sort of fall, and maybe this is refusing to take a stand one direction or the other, but I kind of tend to fall in the middle. I mean, you talked about earlier in your music career and really just earlier in your life that you just really loved all styles and expressions and all these things. And I just wonder if there's a place and a context for all types.
Oh my gosh, of course there is,
Yeah,
because where does God end? I
exactly.
mean, look at the world around us. It is not confined. And I don't think God is confined. I love to be in racially diverse situations. I love to be in even spiritually diverse situations because I just don't see the reason for borders. Like I get boundaries in being healthy emotionally and mentally, and there are people who definitely, you know, I need them to not step over a boundary,
Yeah.
and there are people who need me to do the same, so that's part of healthy living. But when I say no borders, like it just is not of God. I remember being in Nicaragua where I've worked for years in some community development projects. And we were talking with one of the grandmothers. Of course, children are one of the primary ways to begin to change the cycle of a community. And that goes across the world. It doesn't matter how impoverished or how wealthy. And so a lot of the programs are focused on children. And I was talking through the translator with one of the grandmothers and asking why would it be important, or does it feel important, or does it feel strange that people from another country would partner with them in these ways. And she said, no, because through the friendship and partnership we have with you guys, we have learned, or maybe further affirmed in our spirits, that God has no boundaries and is without any borders and is a wild frontier. I remember she said, God
Hmm.
is a wild frontier. And I thought, how true. And so even in our music, I remember going to some of those Black gospel shows. I remember going to some just urban R&B shows. And I was like, I'm sorry, white people don't get it.
Hmm.
We like train our bodies to be still. And there is so much in the African American music community. They are so in touch, I believe, with themselves through music. And so I would have some of the most worshipful experiences, even the way they would give themselves over to music,
Hmm.
to their instrument, their vocal, and people don't like us to talk about the contrast and differences. And part of the racial diversity, strangely, is a racial homogenation or whatever. And we're not going to get into all that. But it's like, no, we're different. And by being a part of what is different, I think clues me into more of who God might be.
Mm.
So if we confine our music and our musical styles and we don't allow ourselves to be open to even some things that we're not totally in love with, I think in some ways that's limiting. We may be missing out on some dialogue with God.
Yeah, that's great. So you've written about contemporary Christian music as well through Rich Mullins. And so I love the title of your book, and it's in connection to what we've just been talking about. Winds of Heaven, Stuff of Earth, Spiritual Conversations Inspired by the Life and Lyrics of Rich Mullins.
Mm-hmm.
So for those who are listening, Rich Mullins is a contemporary Christian artist that has been in the music scene for several decades now. What was it about Rich that caused you to write a book like this?
Well, it was a practical thing at first because the 20th anniversary, Rich died in 1997 in his early 40s on the road in an accident, a highway accident. And so it was the 20th anniversary of his death. And so a lot of people of our generation were a lot of musicians, songwriters now who are on their own stages and own platforms were very inspired by Rich and his lyrics and his life. And so that was what, triggered and motivated the writing of it. But from a more philosophical standpoint, just the reason so many were influenced by Rich is because really he was in contemporary Christian music when it was the cleanest of the clean. Like it was kind of this clean pop thing. I mean,
Mm.
when he died, some of the biggest artists alongside him were Michael and Sandy and Amy and Point of Grace or whatever. And so it was this real clean, really produced, really, I mean, it was great. I mean, there were great elements to all that, but Rich would come on stage in jean shorts, cutoffs, and probably after having smoked a pack of cigarettes outside and,
Mm.
barefoot. And then it wasn't just that he was this kind of renegade, rebel, whatever in his person. I think it was very natural to who he was, at least from what I've learned. But also that was reflected in his songwriting. So I think, if you're going to get down to the basics of who we are and what we relate to, it's that we do live in that tension, like I was talking about with the hymn writers earlier. We
Mm.
live in this tension. For those of us who have been compelled by Jesus and are seeking the truths of God, we live in a lot of tension about the things that enter my mind and that leave my mouth and the ways my body interacts with the world around me. And it's like, seems to be opposing what is in the core of me, the core of my spirit and where I'm connecting with God. And so it's been a habit of the church maybe since the 1940s, 50s to sweep that under the rug, to keep it hidden, to just tame it as best as possible. Be a good girl, be a good boy. Well, Rich was willing to live a little more outwardly that he was not a good boy. Like a little bit more of our inward struggles, he let them slip to be on the outside. And then he wrote about those tensions constantly. So I think about one of his most famous songs, Hold Me, Jesus. It says, and I wake up in the night and feel the dark. It's so hot inside my soul. I swear there must be blisters on my heart. So hold me, Jesus, because I'm shaken like a leaf. You have been king of my glory. Won't you be my prince of peace? And I remember my introduction even to that song was my mom. And she loved that lyric and yet was not really a huge Christian music fan. Yet my mom is a very spiritual person. Talk about a dedicated scripture reader, talk about someone who really prays without ceasing throughout her life and is fairly protected, I think, in a lot of ways from some harsher stuff in her life, and she has been for whatever reason. And yet that was her favorite song. It gave me a glimpse into like, even in what seems like the more clean-cut people of humanity relating to this very honest, transparent lyric. It's Rich just had a way of putting it out there in song. I think what we're really experiencing.
It's so great to hear you tell stories and share just the evidence of your giftedness in communicating. We just love to sit here and listen to listen to you tell these stories. And
I could tell you some people who wouldn't love to sit and listen to me talk a long time.
Well, I bet you there's quite a few who love to listen to you. Really, that brings me to my next question. So you're no stranger to podcasts. In fact, one of your more recent pursuits is a really successful series of video podcasts called Dinner Conversations. Tell us how that project came about.
Yeah, well, I've done this interview series for a few years now for the Christian music industry, for gospel music, just celebrating some of their kind of cover artists. And we'd sit down and dig a little deeper than maybe what's your latest single or what's your next record. Well, they wanted to do kind of a legacy piece on Mark Lowry. And of course, Mark is the co-writer with Buddy Green of Mary Did You Know? And has a long history. When I was growing up, was kind of this comedian within kind of the gospel music or faith-based scene, and very, very popular. And so I grew up knowing who Mark was. Well, we met on the set of this interview series and just connected with this kind of thing, what we're doing right now, which is asking questions of one another and conversing and letting the questions help us think of new things and connect to maybe new ideas about God we never thought about before out loud, but have been resonating in our spirits for a long time. So he called me up a few months after that came out, and we both have a love for podcasts, especially like NPR podcasts and real storytelling podcasts. I have some of that journalism bent, with writing in my background, and have a real appreciation for that. And he was like, what could we do that would be, kind of spiritually focused, but we just thought like a podcast. We thought we would just like do it on our phones or something. And we started asking some of our friends at first. And we thought, well, if we're going to have these people in the room or even on the phone, we should get them in the room and we should film them. I have a kind of hand in a production company, so we had some access to be able to get it on film. And so then we thought about, well, where would we want to be sitting? And Mark and I are both, gluttons. So it was like, for sure, food. And then we just started thinking about the dinner table for both of us growing up, but then even beyond growing up, we both have a lot of people around our dinner tables. It's like, you have a lot of time and space around the dinner table. It's actually a real humbling experience. Like, for people to come around the dinner table, you're putting yourself in a fairly vulnerable situation because you're held captive. There's still like kind of an etiquette around the dinner table of listening, not just speaking, but listening. And you're eating in front of people. That's kind of like it's almost like, I don't know, equivalent like going to the restroom or something in front of someone. It's got a like thing to it. It's very just basic. And so I think to share food, of course, I think that goes way back. You see that even in the themes of people throughout history, certainly through our spiritual history, where food has been an impetus for communion. And so that's what we wanted, is to have conversations that would be a very gracious space to create sanctuary. And so we started inviting friends and talking about just topics that we feel like the church today certainly does talk about, but it still kind of doesn't know where the touch point is for some things like divorce and life after divorce, blending families, adoption, of course, which is a real hot topic. Racism, we talked a lot about, had a whole episode about racism in the church and how, especially in the Western world, there's still maybe some, not just healing, but some real progress in that area. And us asking our brothers and sisters, actually asking them their perspective instead of saying, well, I think this is what is wrong, and observing. It's good to observe, but also asking, what can we do, or what hasn't been done, and that goes both ways. So been very interesting. It's turned into a TV show now and is syndicated across the nation. And we were very excited about that because I think it still lives in podcast land, and we're about to release season 2 on Amazon Prime. So that's cool. I think for a long time, I wondered, how in the world is any of this important? You flip some mics on or you turn on some cameras, and it's real easy to enjoy the attention. And I don't think there's anything wrong with expressing yourself or influencing people through these mediums by any means. It can be very powerful. But for me, I couldn't figure out, then there's people who are doing things. There's people who are digging their hands in the dirt of life and shouldering up next to people and getting down in the dirt with them and really raising them up. And I think that's kingdom work. And I remember thinking, how are these conversations, how does it have anything to do with this bigger picture of God? And I remember my cousin, who is a close friend of mine and lives here in Nashville. She's not she's a good friend and family. They don't sit around watching my stuff. So she, I don't know why, I always gift them for Christmas with all my things. But
Right?
More, this is a pillow with my face on it.
Yeah, I know. Who wouldn't? But there was a guest we had that was of interest to her, and she started watching it, and she texted me later and said she had watched it and how important it was for her. And I said, can I ask you, is it important, and why is it important? And she said, the conversation you guys had triggered something in me, a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a long time, but didn't really feel either had the words to articulate it or maybe the courage to believe that it deserved to be out kind of in the public space. And she said, I was then talking when I was having lunch with a friend about this very thing, this conversation that's coming up in my life and in my family. And then sure enough, that motivated something in her that I didn't know about her. And it just kind of had this ripple effect. And so I do think listening in on each other's conversations, just like this one, can help us articulate some things that have yet to be articulated to relate to other people's articulations. But more than that, our stories, I do believe, are very much the same, and we're a people in great need of redemption. And we're looking, for that road, that path to redemption in God. So anyway, I love doing it. I love talking, as you can tell. It is not difficult. And it's like the easiest thing ever. You know what I mean? I love this era of podcasts and all of that because, playing a show or writing a song is way more difficult than this.
Yeah. We just got out of a sermon series called Around the Table. And I love so many of the things that you said. I was sitting here taking notes about the etiquette at the dinner table of listening. And you're right. There's this etiquette, there's these rules that we engage in, even subconsciously when we show up to the dinner table, and that sort of being the hub of the house and the place in which connection can happen. But it has ground rules to be part of it when you come to the table. And so I really like the way in which y'all have set that up in dinner conversations and the way it seems to be connecting with people.
Well, Julia, I think part of the natural etiquette of it is when you were talking about that, it made me think it's the face-to-face, right? We tend to be respectful people, I think, or we tend to be interested in other people. We just don't have a lot of face-to-face time anymore. And that's just a fact. I don't know that that's a criticism. And mealtime is one of those still kind of sacred spaces where we get face-to-face time. And one reason I think it's so important is because we can put a lot of things out there on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and I don't have any real huge criticism of that either. I'm certainly a participator in it. I was talking with a friend more recently, and we have coffee maybe, I don't know, once every 6 months. So we see each other a couple times a year, but known each other a while. And he's experienced some real heartache in his I think, faith journey that's tied into some with what I would call the hyper focus of some segments of Christianity, or maybe some pulpits or speakers in the conversation around sexuality.
Mm.
And that's produced a lot of just tension and heartache in his life. And I would get some text from him occasionally with like a link to a story where some maybe pastor or maybe a Christian leader, a leader that's associated with Christianity, was saying something that I don't think any of the three of us, I'll especially speak for myself, could get behind in its tone or motivation or manner.
Mm.
But real, just meaningless type of things said specifically to the homosexual community. And I kept getting these links and getting these questions from him, like, and he's a Christian as well. So like he was asking me as a Christian, how can I associate when these are some people who are saying they associate with Christianity, as far as like just the tone of it and the level of malice in it.
Mm.
And I didn't have a lot of answers, I mean, I would say it's a link shared on Facebook, I don't even know who wrote it. I don't even know it's good journalism. I don't even know if it's all telling the truth. And I don't know who the bozo is. It's not my pastor and it's not my friend. I don't know, like that's a lot of my answers to a lot of things. I don't know. But finally, because we're sitting face to face having coffee, right? So we're in the same space as each other. And I said, do you believe that I am a Christian? And he said, yes. And I said, have I ever treated you that way? And he said, no. And I said, could I be your first example of who Jesus might be? And the face-to-face element gives us, I think, a more pure opportunity to really be for one another what we're called to be, what we're asked to be, what we were created to be. And I do think we'll end up interacting more like Jesus. So, I just think it's important to sit with one another. And I sure can hear a lot more about someone's life that I don't understand. And someone can sit with me and all the things they don't understand about my life or my choices or my decisions. Face to face, we can sit in that and be a lot more generous, gracious, merciful, and understanding of one another. And I think when we leave those conversations, because of the grace and mercy that's present with face to face conversations, we leave wanting to be different.
Mm.
I think, that's I'll put all that in the I think category.
Well, Andrew, you've been really self-deprecating of your own theological backbone, but just a really pastoral presence and sense about you. And I know that in the midst of all of these other pursuits, you're still serving the local church on staff as the worship leader at a church in Franklin, Tennessee. How does keeping a foot in the local church continue to shape your faith experience? And is it different than all of the other work that you do around the country?
It's very different, and it's the most difficult.
Amen.
Yeah, you understand that, both of you. There's a lack of autonomy, which is probably important, especially I'm a single guy and no kids. So I can really crave autonomy. And you don't have as much of that in the local setting. I'll tell you the truth, like this is a very much what I would title a season for me. I don't explicitly feel called for my profession to be tied into one local church for my life. This was a very unique situation I was already a congregant at my church here, and a very unique situation where myself and also one of our other congregants, who's a fantastic educated musician, works in our school systems, where we're partnering together to help steady and grow the musical aspects of our church for the next person coming in. And I like that because I like to build bridges and to be a transition. And I like to be useful, right? We're talking about the Enneagram, and I'm a 2, so I'm the helper, which has a lot of vices. But, in the pure kind of motivation, I'm a helper. And so, that called to me directly when my pastor talked to me about doing this and helping us transition into this next stage. So all that to come back to, I had a lot of insecurities about it going into it. I have a lot of darkness in my history, in my background. I have strong addictions that will have to be addressed my entire life. And I didn't grow up in a family that produced shame. And I don't know that I've ever been encouraged by my community around me for that either. So I don't know that shame is totally the ticket that was causing the insecurity, but I just had enough awareness of myself that I didn't know if I had the qualifications because of that to help shepherd. And I still question that, if I'm going to be really, really honest. And I still am not sure about that. But I'm leaning into it. And I have been encouraged by several people who mean a lot to me to press into it for now. And I have a certain confidence in that. I love people singing, you know. I love to hear us press into our faith through singing. So I consider it a great honor, more than anything I've done around the country, great or small. I consider this maybe the highest honor, but also produces the highest level of intrigue and curiosity about how and why I would be used in this way.
Gosh, there's so much there that I want to comment on, but
Maybe for another conversation
we'll
on
just
another
have
day.
to have another conversation. Yeah. Andrew, this has just been wonderful to get to spend some time with you today. We have one last question that we ask every person who comes on the podcast, and I think it'll be a great connection to what you've just talked about. And that question is this: up until this point in your life, what is one thing you wish someone would have told you?
Wow. That's a doozy of a question to end with. If I can answer kind of twice, I grew up with some incredible parents that did not know the road ahead for me, and I didn't know the road ahead for me. You know, we don't choose a lot of that. And they definitely made space for me and each of my brothers around the table, as if everything that we brought to the table was okay, you know, and not just okay, but beautiful, you know. So I think that message that I still long to hear, which is "you're okay," is one I did hear and still carry with me, but I still long to hear it. Now, if I could think of something that was not said to me that I would have loved said to me, would just be something like, "That's not your burden." I carried a lot, you know, even as a kid, that I don't think anyone placed on me to some degree. And I experienced some things that had some trauma, you know, associated with it. And I just carried it as if it was mine, you know. So I think if there's a message that I have to say to myself a lot, it's like, that's not yours. And with that, it's kind of the same statement as "you're not Jesus."
Right.
You know, like, it's not yours. So I don't know if that makes any sense, you know, to other people, but to me, it's a powerful statement. It's a visual for me of literally taking everything off my shoulders and just wiping it off. You know, you're free. So, you know, eventually it'll all be wiped off. One day.
That's
One
right.
day.
Yeah,
That's
that's
right.
great.
Andrew, what a joy to talk to you today. Again, you're not lying when you say it, that conversation just comes naturally to you. It's just a joy to talk to you. It's wonderful to hear your stories, and we really appreciate you taking the time to come on and have a conversation with us today.
Completely my pleasure. You guys have been awesome. And Eric, of course, we have to fiddle around together again.
Let's make music again soon. Thanks, Andrew.
You're welcome.
In planning our Lenten worship series, The Greatest Story, our aim as a worship team was to remind our church and to remind ourselves of the truths that are evident in the scriptures, the truths that are evident in the greatest story ever told. And one of those truths, Andrew reminded us of today, that not all burdens are ours to carry. And if we feel that we are carrying a burden, Jesus gives us an opportunity to lay that burden at his feet.
We want to leave you today with a scripture that comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 28, where Jesus tells us to lay down our burden. It says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light."
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of More Than Sunday. If you like the podcast, please feel free to share it, go online and leave a comment, or give us a rating so that others might hear about us. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure you also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at fumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Special thanks to Andrew Greer for joining us this week, and make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation with J.D. Walt. Have a great week.